Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Oops, excuse me. In the job description, I had another hat when I was in arts and science, which was head of technology also. And so if you have jobs that are totally different, then you have the possibility of they're saying, well, he's not very good at it, but we understand he's, a good historian. And then, of course, you have colleagues in history and say, well, he's marginal, but he does a good job in technology. So this is the one hat. But the good news is that these 4 weeks that I will be presenting, it's all right. You will be beguiled in the last 2 weeks when Tom Schwartz takes over. This course, as you know, was prompted by what many view as an unprecedented political unrest throughout the Arab world during the last year. With some cases, the protracted demonstrations, sometimes accompanied by violent insurrections, have toppled regimes that have been in power for over 20 years. The regimes that are still in place threatened to be overthrown or scrambling to offer reforms that will placate the anger of the crowds. Now, this cataclysm is taking place when the United States is more involved in the region than at any time in our history. We're fighting 2 wars and involved in a contentious Israeli-Palestinian standoff, and we're operating now in a shifting political, cultural, social environment. So, as stated, and in the schedule, I will start off and look at the region from about 1900 and look to see the roots, or what is the dynamics, both internal and external in the region, of what may have prompted this. In the last 2 sessions, Professor Schwartz will focus on U.S. foreign policy and the factors that have led to our increasing involvement in the region, along with his assessment of our current challenges and opportunities in the region. So we're casting a wide net, but the focus will be principally on the Arab world. I'm sorry. Because we are not clear. Oh. I'm sorry. Damn computers. Right. Because we may not cover everything, we do hope to leave at least 15 minutes for discussion in each session, though we may run a little over today. We also recognize that it can be difficult to keep track of regions, people and regions. Well, to help you keep track of the regions, we've passed out a map with the contemporary Middle East on one side, and then phases of the Palestine, Israel, from about 1920 to the present. We also have included in our course schedule I should point out, this is in color. I thought it would be black and white, but Norma said, no, we'll do it in color. But of course, this is Vanderbilt, so it even sounds expensive. We hope that what you hear here will pique your interest, and you may wish to do some additional reading. So at the appended at the end of the schedule a short list of selected readings that we have found to be not only informative, but well written and for the average reader. Okay, the other map. Now, this is hard to read. It's all right. Some of these are hard to read, but at least it gives you a sense. Those are Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the Golan Heights in 2006. But at least you can get a sense of the density of those settlements. Okay, so for today, we're going to talk, I'm going from Ottomanism to Arab nationalism. Really World War I to the new mediators. From the early 1500s, the Ottoman Empire emerged as the dominant power in North Africa and the Middle East and in the Arab world. At its height in 1700, you can see that the Ottoman Empire spans Europe, Asia, and North Africa, being somewhat balanced between the European and Arab provinces. While the rulers were Muslim and of Turkic origin, the empire was a vast multi-ethnic and religious quilt, with central and provincial governments, staffed by men from throughout the empire from differing religious and ethnic backgrounds. In fact, most historians, the region, and in fact world history, people who have looked at the world, say the Ottoman Empire was one of the most successful multi-ethnic, multi-religious enterprises the world has seen. Now, it is true that it was nominally a Muslim state, and this was reinforced in the early 1500s when Ottoman forces invaded Greater Syria, that is the Middle East and North Africa, starting in about 1515, and spread all the way over to current Algeria. Now, at that time, the Sultan appended the title Caliph or Khalifa to his many, many titles, meaning Khalifa Rusul Allah, or it's a successor of the Prophet. Now, this was acquired when the Mamluks fell, and the Mamluks had held the caliphate at that time. But at first, this action was really prompted by the fact that the Sultan didn't want someone else holding the title, getting competed things. And in fact, it was seldom used until for the next 300 years. Other titles tended to be, excuse me, to have pride of place. But as the empire contracted, the Arab world, and of course the Muslim world, became an increasingly important part of the empire. And the Sultan did begin to, especially after about 1800, mid-1700s, the Sultan increased the emphasis on his rule as caliph and protector of the holy places in Mecca, Medina, and Palestine, meaning especially Jerusalem. But the empire remained a mix of secular and religious rule. Although in the 19th century, vis-a-vis the reorganization or Tanzimat, a number of secular reforms came into the empire, especially after 1839 and 1856. In Ottoman Turkish, I should point out, there was no word for reform. And in traditional societies, in fact, there was no sense that you change. Your job as a ruler was to preserve, not to change. Well, in the first instance, it did shrink. And in 1900, you can see that the Ottoman Empire, still extending into Libya, was, although at this time, containing only about 1.6 million square miles as opposed to the 4 million square miles that it occupied at its height. It remained dominant in North Africa and the Middle East. Since 1881, Egypt had been controlled by Britain, but it did so in the name of the Sultan. So it was viewed as a dual mandate, with the Sultan still being the sovereign. Now, the empire faced two handicaps, major handicaps. One was the Treaty of Capitulations. This is where we get kind of that term, to capitulate, which was first entered into with France in the 16th century. Now, this is a free trade treaty, actually. And free trade is what a country enters into when they're on the top. Countries never enter into this when they're on the bottom. If you notice that, we were protectionists until, after World War II. And then staunch defenders of free trade as Britain came up to free trade in the 19th century. These agreements meant that the Ottomans, especially in the 19th century, could not raise tariffs against the onslaught of European goods, with all powers getting most favored nation treatment, which had ramifications with the economy. Oops. The other was, in the latter part of the 19th century, the establishment of Anglo-French dual financial control commissions or courts in the Ottoman Empire, then in Egypt, and also later in Persia. These commissions oversaw Ottoman revenue, with at least 25% of that revenue being sent to pay off debts owed to European banks. But this meant a 25% decrease in whatever revenue there were. Now, in 1900, the Sultan, the reigning Sultan, Abdul Hamid, known as the Red Sultan, had been in power for 25 years, essentially 25 years. And he had grown increasingly despotic. Actually, it was at the beginning of his reign that Europeans began to dub the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, which is where most Americans entered ever looking at the Ottoman Empire, which is why I had to have that bit of introduction. And it saddens me that we're not going to spend more time on it, but I have to keep on task. On ascending the throne, it promulgated a constitution with elected representatives in a national assembly. But in 1878, he abrogated the constitution and dismissed the elected members. But it was still a jobs bill because they continued to be paid, which when there are strikes in Turkey and other places, the faculty continue to get paid? When they close them down? Then I love snow days. Vanderbilt never offered them. During this period, the government became increasingly centralized, more secular, but also saw a great expansion in the secret police. Abdul Hamid became increasingly paranoid about people seeking to overthrow him. Now, in this case, his paranoia was somewhat correct. For Ottoman civilians exiles who fled to Europe and other places, but were centered in Paris, argued for a revolution to restore the Constitution. Within the empire, secret societies dominated by the military, who was probably at the forefront in terms of westernization in the Ottoman Empire, with more modern military academies, etc., and having relations with European countries. But these disenchanted military formed secret societies looking for opportunities to change the government. And by 1905, the Committee for Union and Progress, otherwise known as CUP, became the most organized faction and embracing many military officers, including a young captain, Mustafa Kemal. Now, the Young Turk Revolution broke out in 1909, when disturbances in Macedonia were difficult to put down because disgruntled soldiers refused to fight. They did this to a great extent because their pay had been in arrears for several months. The revolution spread, gained support from Britain and France, seeing this as a means of changing the empire, but mainly the British and French press. And in short order, the government, Abdul Hamid, agreed to change or restore the Constitution. Now, the ensuing elections brought forth 142 Turks, 60 Arabs, 25 Albanians, 23 Greeks, 12 Armenians, 5 Jews, and a number of others to create an assembly of 275 members or deputies. And the assembly was revived. In addition to the religious and ethnic mix, there were various factions comprising both traditional elites and more westernized elites, principally from urban areas throughout the empire. Now, while the Committee for Union and Progress only had 60 deputies, they were the most organized and soon would dominate the assembly. In 1909, beset by further foreign incursions from without, the Sultan appealed to the chief caliph, or chief religious officer in the Ottoman Empire, the Sheikhul Islam. This is an interesting office. He actually was appointed by the Sultan, but in some respects was superior to the Sultan because he was the chief interpreter of Muslim law. Got him on his side and staged a counter revolution. But the CUP was decisive in countering the Sultan. An army group in Macedonia was called into Istanbul, to then Constantinople, put down the opposition to the counter-coup, and in turn turned down the Sultan and replaced him. This happened a few times. Nasser did essentially the same thing. The new Sultan, the 65-year-old Mehmed V, commented that he had never read a newspaper. And as one author pointed out, he had superb makings for a constitutional monarch. But the first, and here is the empire, actually, 1913, we'll go back though a bit. The first problem was in Libya. When the Italians invaded Libya in 1911, Tripoli fell quickly, but the Italians encountered much opposition when they tried to go into the interior, and their 20,000 troop military force soon grew to approximately 150,000 soldiers against, about 20,000 Arabs and Turkish soldiers. So it was a hard slog. But eventually, the Italians won the day and in 1912 declared suzerainty over Libya. But the Libyan Arabs continued to fight. And interestingly enough, they were led by Muhammad Idris, a Senussi Arab, who in 1951 became the king of an independent Libya in terms of continuity. So resistance had not abated, and what they were resisting was, in fact, the removal from the Ottoman Empire, with the Italians substituting for them. So that in 1913, this is the map of the Middle East. The colors are not. So the two dominant states, Persia and the Ottoman Empire. But as you can see, it still extends down into Yemen, into the head of the Persian Gulf, and still into the Balkans. The loss of Libya was followed by a series of Balkan crises. So that you have, on the eve of World War I, the Ottomans having been at war essentially for 5 years. And the government had taken on a more military cast. Here's a picture of Emperor Wilhelm of Germany visiting Constantinople in 1909. And in fact, the Ottoman military had had a relatively long relationship, a little over 20 years, with the Germans and German military advisors. And one of the things that attracted the Ottomans to the Germans is that the Germans were the only European power that did not covet Ottoman territory, or did not seemingly covet Ottoman territory. And it was the only power that agreed that the capitulations should not continue to be in force. There was one other thing leading to war. Enver Pasha, who was a hero in the Libyan campaign, and saw himself in that light, he looked in the mirror, he said, I am pretty good. Thank you very much. And so he envisioned recapturing territory lost to the Russians in the Caucasus Mountains. But in November of 1914, after the Allies had declared war on the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, with the Sultan declaring that this action constituted a holy war or jihad against the Allies. Now, I have this picture of the Goben, or renamed the Sultan Selim ship. How the Ottomans got into the war is the British refused in August, before the war, to send ships that the Ottoman battleships, cruisers, that the Ottomans had ordered for the Ottoman Navy. This is before the war began. In the negotiations with the Germans in September, the Germans agreed to offer 2 ships to the Ottomans. These ships circumvented the British blockade, went to Istanbul, German flag came down, Turkish flag went up, and fezzes were substituted for the sailor hat, but the crews didn't change. And these German ships, the Germans wanted the Ottomans in the war, these ships went and bombarded Odessa and some other Russian ports, which upset the Russians. But actually, the Russians were hoping for such a thing. So this is that sequence that prompted the war. Now, the interesting thing of the German declaration is that this is really the first time that the Sultan Caliph had declared a jihad. And this scared the bejesus out of the, especially the British and French, since both empires embraced large Muslim populations. The Ottomans were hoping for uprisings against the British and French, but in fact, these did not take place. But the traffic, my God, these district commissioners and northern Nigeria and in Aden, and actually within the Indian Empire, said, what are we going to do? There was one exception. The Libyan insurgents continued their pressure on the Italians, which forced the Italians to withdraw to Tripoli. And so that was the only area in Libya that the Italians were able to control during World War I. And the insurrections went on, actually with some other leaders, up until the late 1920s. Now, as with all the other states that entered the war, the Ottoman government assumed that it would be a short affair. But unlike the other powers, the public was not for the war. After all, they had been in war for 5 years. The death toll had been pretty horrendous. They were tired, exhausted. The economy was not weak, so this was not seen as a great opportunity. But because he thought it would be a short war, in short order, and there led a very large army of over 100,000 men in an ill-fated campaign against the Russians in the Caucasus. The casualty rate here was over 85% because it lasted much longer. And he started in December, which is not the best time to fight in the mountains. I now live in Mount Eagle, and it's not a good time to fight there. And that's only it's less than 2,000 feet, just less. It's not a mountain. But what had become quite clear, if you look at memos and other things during the war, the Allies were were quite interested in dividing up the empire. I will not go into the battles in the war, I will not dwell on them, except to say that while the Ottoman Empire was seen as easy pickings, they proved not to be. They won significant battles in the Dardanelles and in Iraq, or at that time Mesopotamia, at Kut. And you see these at the British Imperial War Museum, both for Gallipoli and for Kut, the siege of Kut. Now, to facilitate, in British eyes, taking Ottoman territory and dividing up the country was they needed to counter the Sultan Caliph's role among Muslims. This was seen because the British viewed Arabs essentially as Muslims. Now they are Muslims, but it's similar to looking at Americans essentially as Christians. Their whole body is Christians. Now I say Americans because America has one of the highest degrees of religiosity in the world, the United States. The only other area that comes as close, actually, is the Arab world, the Middle East, Muslim world. It's the sub and substance of Arabness. And they were quite sure that they understood the Arab. To this end, in 1915, there's ensued a series of correspondence between Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Sharif Hussein was a descendant of the Prophet and had been appointed by the Sultan earlier to be in charge of the holy places of Mecca and Medina in the Hejaz region. But he had increasingly provoked the Sultan. There were two families that really traded this off over the preceding few centuries. And he was therefore looking to shore up his position. Which way should they go? And his family was divided, actually, with his oldest son, Abdullah, favoring the Ottomans, and his youngest son, Faisal, favoring the British. But he did this not as what we would say is a new nationalist leader, a new nationalist type. He was very much a traditional man, a traditional emir, and not imbued with Western theories of nationalism. But in his second note, Sir Henry promised the following. In return for Hussein's leadership in provoking an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, Britain would undertake the following. Recognize and support the independence of the Arabs in the Middle East, south of Anatolia, and to not include those districts west of Damascus in the north. So Arab independence was promised for what is now Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, and the Hejaz. Further, they said they would assist Hussein and the Arabs in this with military support against what they called Turkey, but the Ottoman forces, and continue to advise the Arabs in setting up independent government. But it was fairly clear that it would be independent government. And in 1916, agreeing to this, the Arab revolt broke out. As it developed, his youngest son, Emir Faisal, played by Omar Sharif in Lawrence of Arabia, and T.E. Lawrence, who was an advisor, but took leadership roles in a march from the Hejaz to Damascus, ending up protecting General Allenby's eastern flank in Palestine in 1917. And they were successful. On October 3rd, the Hejaz army entered Damascus, which is north of the Arab. Now, they had found the city had already been liberated by Damascene Arabs in wake of the Ottomans' retreat from the city on September 30th. And also there were some Canadian and forward Canadian and British units. Fact remains that Hussein kept his word. The Arabs kept their word. But the British did not keep their word. And they had other plans for the future of the region. The British made other promises that would completely undermine both the letter and spirit of what Sir Henry had promised Hussein. In May of 1916, the British agreed with the French in an agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The agreement initially carved up Anatolia and Greater Syria. And Greater Syria involves Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and often Mesopotamia. Among the British, French, and Russians, with the Russians getting northern Anatolia and Constantinople. This map does not show the Russian portion. When the Russians dropped out of the war, Greece and Italy were enticed to remain in the war on the side of the Allies, but dividing up the Russian sphere between them. Then in November 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, which began as follows. I love the wording of this. All administrators should love the wording of this. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and we use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Now, unlike the McMahon-Hussein correspondence and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, this was a public declaration. But it was also most vague and did not spell out what constituted a national home. And this can be seen in the Arabic translation of the Balfour Declaration, where instead of national home, the term millet is used. Now, a millet in Ottoman society, in Ottoman government, meant autonomous community, but one that was still subordinate to the larger community. The problem was, in the West, there isn't any concept of national home. So it was viewed in the West as, oh, they mean a state, and this is where you still hear this. Well, they promised a state. Well, that's not necessarily clear. And in fact, in the Ottoman Empire, there were Christian and Jewish millets. That meant that their courts were autonomous. If you were a Jew, you were charged and you were tried in a Jewish court. This is one of the few places the Jewish government court systems actually were in existence. And if you were a Muslim, you were charged in a Muslim court. If you were a Christian, in a Christian court. And this was extended to Protestants, etc., in the 19th century. So one of my colleagues mentioned this is a wonderful case of creative ambiguity. And sometimes as an administrator, I'd say, well, I think I view with favor such a proposal. When I had a pretty good idea, it wouldn't go through. But with the competing promises, or these competing promises became the basis of deciding the fate of the Middle East at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and flew in the face, though they were issued earlier, but flew in the face of Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination, a term that infected the populations of the Middle East and North Africa. Now, the British were cognizant of the fact that they had made competing agreements. There was kind of a smug self-assurance that the people in the region, though, looked to them for guidance. They kept saying this, well, they really like us. And we all keep hearing this again and again and again with types of things. Well, they really like us. They don't want us to leave. Now, if this wasn't enough, in late in 1918, early 1919, the British had 350 British Dominion and colonial troops in the region to reinforce the idea that they liked them. And it is true that in the main, the British and the French got their way, and large swaths of land would be added to the two empires. And the redrawing of the map showed an impressive increase of imperial holdings on both sides. But by the time the peace conference convened, the people in the region had begun to make their views known. And the first instance was you have resistance to continuation of British rule in Egypt and the imposition of a British protectorate that had occurred in 1914. And this was immediate. Or if you look at the next map, you see dates of the opposition to European rule or influence in the region. The intensity of these uprisings, of these nationalist revolts from March 1919 into the 1920s really represents the first Arab Spring. But then it also extended into Turkey, Iran, and Berber, Morocco. First was the Egyptian uprising of 1919. Egyptians looked to a new day and looked to be the end of the protectorate with the end of the war. And a group that became known as the Egyptian delegation, or WAFT, requested that they be allowed to attend the Paris Peace Conference. The High Commissioner refused, dismissing the WAFT leader, Said Zargul, and his colleagues on the ground of, you don't represent anybody. Now this is another fact, this is a constant. It is fascinating to me that foreigners claim that people, at least in the domestic, don't represent anybody, where in fact they tend to represent more than any of the foreigners represent. But we will see this as a theme, a root. You can write it down, a root. But this is fascinating. In response, Zargul prepared powers of attorney for people to sign and mail to the Egyptian Sultan. The Khedive of Egypt had been made Sultan when it was made a protectorate, Sultan, supposedly independent of the Ottomans. But he was now subordinate to the British. These were separate powers of attorney, and this was the 1919 version of social networks in terms of using the post. The Sultan was flooded. There were hundreds of thousands of these that had been sent in, mailed in throughout Egypt. In response to this, the British did what they normally would do. They arrested the leaders of the VAK. And with this, we begin to have demonstrations emanating at pretty much the same time. The secular Egyptian University in Cairo and the Islamic Al-Azhar University in Cairo. Al-Azhar being one of the oldest universities in the world. The British backed down, let them go to Paris. Just before they arrived in Paris, the British secured from President Wilson this agreement that the protectorate should continue. Now, they did this giving two reasons. One was communications, Suez, and the other to protect foreign and actually foreign citizens and minorities. When word reached that the protectorate had been approved, the demonstration spread from Cairo and Alexandria to the rest of the country. In the main, they were non-violent demonstrations, although there were attacks on foreign enclaves. There was strikes by communications and later postal workers, etc. And in the end, both in policing, etc., about 3,000 people died, about 50 to 60 being European. One of the interesting moments was a demonstration of 300 elite women in the fray. And you see they even devised a new flag. And the elite women were led by Hoda Sharawi, and she became instrumental in the first women's political party in the Middle East. And it was the first instance of this. The British continued to prevaricate, establishing a commission, but even the commission reported that the British were on untenable grounds. So after a series of ill-fated negotiations, the British, somewhat in a huff, issued a unilateral declaration of independence for Egypt. But not complete. They had everything, but not the canal zone or communications, not defense, not foreign interests, not minorities. And this was to continue until, much of it till 1936, but not really settled until 1956. But in 1923, Egypt adopted a new constitution, and Saad Zaghloul became the first elected prime minister in the history of Egypt. And this revolution is still celebrated as a holiday. Next is Iraq, Syria and Iraq. In the defeated Ottoman sphere, the occupation and disposition of Syria and Iraq were intertwined. With the occupation of Damascus by the British and with the acquiescence of the French, the British appointed Emir Faisal as the administrator, and he soon became viewed as the king of Iraq. Now, the British thought, this is a great opportunity. We're getting our man in here, and we can contravene the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And enlarge the area that we will control. Now, Faisal, who was a rather dour personality, frankly, he wasn't as sprightly as Omar Sharif, but recognized that he was a foreigner. In fact, he was. And most of the, well, we'll see in a minute, as a foreigner, so he called in the creation of an elected Syrian National Congress to reinforce his standing and claims that he would put forward in the Paris Peace Conference. Delegates came from all over Greater Syria, and most were actually anti-Hashemite and pro-Ottoman. And of course, they had a differing view of what constituted Syria. So they called for the independence of Syria, a Syria that would include Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. Now, as I said, they still had a great attachment to the Ottoman, and the Sultan Caliph was still on the throne in 1919. And this was true of both traditional and more Western delegates. And there was no discernible desire to be ruled by Europeans. But if it was not possible to remain under Ottoman rule, then they wanted an independent Syria. And during the last part of 1919, felt compelled to support the Congress. In fact, they said they would go to war to meet their demands. In 1920, the French general election in France defeated Poncier's government, and a new government came in dominated by the colonialist powers, or faction. It became more vociferous in upholding the Sykes-Picot Agreement and putting a French administration in Syria. The British didn't resist this because while they supported Faisal in Damascus, they didn't like the idea that they were also looking at Palestine, Jordan, and to some extent Mesopotamia. So they agreed with the French demand. And in 1920, French Senegalese troops occupied Damascus and exiled King Faisal. While the initial occupation was easy, between 1925 and 1927, there was a revolution that emanated out of the Druze region in southern Syria that became known as the Great Syrian Revolt. And that involved 250,000 French troops that had just left a Berber revolt in Morocco that involved that number. Now the story continues to Iraq. And you see, with Faisal leaving Damascus, the British said, well, we may think about Iraq. But the people of Iraq, hearing about what was coming out of the peace conference, were already in revolt. And when news reached that the peace conference would issue a mandate to Britain for the region, this revolt escalated, starting in Mosul in the north and joined in a coalition between the Sunni and Shia factions of the country. A split that I know you're quite aware of in recent years. But the idea of rule by the British was more than sufficient to bring them together to go against this. And this required over 50,000 British and colonial troops to put down the revolt, including bringing in the RAF. And we're getting close to where to stop. But this was allowed by the then Minister of War, Winston Churchill, where the RAF ended up bombing villages, which had that was the 1919 version of shock and awe. Now, T.E. Lawrence thought this was a great idea. In fact, he later became an airman, ranker after the war, a little fed up. And the reason he did, the British would fly over and send leaflets, drop leaflets on what they love to refer to as truculent areas. Truculent is something that goes through all the archives. They're being truculent. And fanatics, this is the thing that fascinates me. They used fanatics because they were opposing this, comes to mind. And said, you need to quiet down. You need to stop your resistance. Then if they didn't stop, they would be bombed. And so Lawrence thought this was a very civilized way of waging warfare. And when I read this, I was thinking, if he had lived, what would T.E. Lawrence think of Bomber Harris in World War II, the British commander? But what this did, and just very shortly, the British were forced to reconsider their stand. How could they do this? Or these revolts clearly showed that the people of the region did not view the coming of the Europeans, be they French, British, or Italian, as being an engine for progress or salvation. When an Iraqi delegation met with Woodrow Wilson, he called them a handful of ungrateful politicians. But there was nothing the Arabs could do. The Europeans were intent. The imperial system was seen as important, and the expansion of that system was seen as their just desserts. Now, not only the economic argument, but there was another argument here. It was more than simple economics or greed in terms of the Europeans and people of North America. In a sense, there was this kind of smug sense of Western superiority that was heavily undergirded by racism. They viewed themselves as a civilizing mission in Asia and Africa, and the economies were kind of their just desserts. Now, a shining example of this is Woodrow Wilson, who shunned colonial acquisitions. But remember, he was also the president that put in the color bar in the civil service, the federal civil service in the United States. So it was racist. Now, this was dealt with at the Cairo conference in 1921 that was now headed by the new colonial secretary, Winston Churchill. And they hit on the following. And I call this, have kings will travel. We'll do it in a more indirect way, and we'll use Arab leaders. Now, what Arab leaders had the best chance of succeeding? The Hashemites again. And of course, they participated in the revolt. Faisal would become king of Syria. Abdullah would become the emir of Transjordan, split off from the original Palestine. And Hussein would remain king of the Hejaz. But here's the irony. In Saudi Arabia, you have the rise of Ibn Saud, a fascinating character. And Ibn Saud had his eyes on the Hejaz. Now, you would think that the British would defend their old friend Hussein, but Ibn Saud's forces first entered the Hejaz in 1919, and over the next 2 years really secured control of the Hejaz. Did the Europeans covet Arabia? No. Why would they? It was just a sandbox full of truculent natives. But they did show support for Hussein by sending a ship to take him from the Hejaz. In fact, he ended up, in the last year of his life, settling in Jerusalem with Abdullah, his senior son. So this is just an inkling, but I think a good inkling of what I will really call the first Arab Spring. Were they successful? No. This was the map. And people in the region looked at this and said, God, we're on top of the world in terms of Europeans and America. But underneath this, there was a kind of a smoldering cauldron. And this issue of foreign rule would continue to beset the area for almost the next 100 years. In fact, 100 years if you include American incursions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, I was going to talk about how Turkey became Turkey because it ended up as independent, but I'm going to stop now and ask if there are any questions. Does anyone have any questions? If you don't, I can talk about it. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I know, that's what I just said. I was going to include a short mention, which that hurts me the most, of course. He said, I haven't talked about Ataturk. Yeah. And I'm saddened to say I haven't, because one of my heroes, where in fact Turkey was supposed to be carved up. Ataturk and other military people prevented the Greeks and Italians and French from taking their claim and creating the Republic of Turkey. Now, they did one other thing which is important. With the advent of the Turkish Republic in 1923, the government did two things. It entered a secular path where they looked to Europe, the West, for cues. And they turned their back on the Middle East, not to return to the dawn of the 21st century, in both becoming more involved in the Middle East and becoming more involved or having a greater sympathy for Islam and Islamic institutions. That's the shortest thing I've ever done on Ataturk. But does that answer your question? Good. Thank you for asking it. Anything else? Yes.
That they wouldn't get somewhat a Western.
They wouldn't get. Let me go back to 1913 to. Okay, see this? They essentially wouldn't get Lebanon. The British knew, the French had had pretty much a long resistance relationship with the Christians in Mount Lebanon. So the British knew they weren't going to get that. They didn't care about that. What they wanted actually was to prevent the French from getting close to Suez. Because, you know, they were such devoted allies. And so first was Suez. So west of Damascus really meant Lebanon. It didn't talk about this region. In the first instance, it was talking about the Arabs getting Palestine. And a number of people in the government said that should be the case. In fact, Edwin Montagu, who was Secretary of State for India and Jewish, opposed the Balfour Declaration because he said this is not going to go well in the colonies, especially in the Muslim world. And India was, you know, at least 30% Muslim at the time. India and Pakistan. Yes?
What does it say in the blue?
Oh, I'm sorry. It says blue zone.
Yeah.
Yes. And it says direct French rule. So the darker color is direct rule, the lighter color is influence. The interesting thing here is you have the British wanting direct influence in Mesopotamia. Now this is oil. This is the oil issue, both there and in Persia, with British petroleum. And then under British influence here, thinking that this would be part of the Arab state that would be under British influence. Now, this international is showing some gleanings that there were kind of shifts in Britain about what to do with Palestine. The oil issue first developed actually in Persia and where the British secured well, I'm not going to about that. Where the British secured control of southern Persia, and then there were some oil drilling in Mesopotamia during the Ottoman period. And Persia was key for the British Navy's switch to oil, which occurred before and during World War I. Now remember, at this time, the greatest oil producer in the world was the United States. And ours would last forever. So, but if you wanted other sources, become important. Yes.
Sort of a footnote.
Well, they became British, but they were taken by the British later 19th century. And that became contentious also. Yes.
When you looked at the,
Yes.
And it said Ibn.
Son of. Abdulaziz Ibn Saud, but I mean, literal meaning, which is same as Ben in Hebrew.
Okay. So,
It would be son of Saud.
okay.
But generally referred to as it, but the name is a great name. Abdulaziz Ibn Saud. I had students repeat it. Said, no, isn't that great? And he had, you know, he was in sword fights, and he had some gashes. Fascinating figure. And emerged out of the Nejd region to the south. There had been competition there and rose up. Used to keep, and then we got involved with oil. But it was in the late 20s, early 30s when that occurred. Then it became, important. But what they did with Hussein, I think, was kind of icing on the cake in terms of turning their back on him. Although he could be an ornery character. Sometimes truculent. Any other questions? Well, I hope you have a good lunch. I hope to see most of you. Tomorrow there's always attrition. They say, I don't want to go back to that. Thank you.